Eric Dalton was the kind of man people barely noticed, a quiet mechanic who fixed engines by day and lived alone by night. But when police opened the trunk of his abandoned sedan and found 3 bodies wrapped in plastic, his ordinary mask shattered into the face of a predator hiding in plain sight. It started with something small, something so ordinary that no one would have expected it to lead to one of the most disturbing discoveries the town had ever seen. Early on a Tuesday morning, a man out for his daily jog spotted a car tucked away under an old concrete bridge. At first, he didn't think much of it. Cars were often parked in odd places, sometimes left behind by people fishing in the river or kids sneaking off to drink. But what caught his attention was the stillness. The black sedan had been there the day before, and when he returned for his run that morning, it hadn't moved an inch. The same dirt clung to the tires, the same streak of mud traced across the back bumper. Something about it felt wrong, like time had stopped around it. The jogger decided to call the police, not because he thought it was dangerous, but because he thought it might be abandoned. Maybe stolen, maybe dumped by someone who didn't want to be found. Officers arrived about half an hour later, their patrol cars idling with flashing lights that bounced off the bridge's gray surface. They approached slowly, scanning the windows. From the outside, the vehicle didn't scream trouble. The windshield was clouded with a thin layer of condensation, as if no one had touched it for days. The side mirrors were folded in, suggesting someone had parked it deliberately, not recklessly. But when they pulled on the driver's door, it was locked tight. They circled the car again, shining flashlights through the glass, trying to get a clearer look. On the back seat lay a dark jacket, neatly folded, and a soda can resting in the Q folder, the kind of everyday items that gave the car an eerie sense of normality. Nothing seemed violently disturbed, but that was exactly what unsettled them. Everything was to calm, to neat. When the officers finally popped the trunk with a spare tool, the air shifted. It wasn't just the metallic creak of the hinges. It was the smell, thick and unmistakable, that rushed out the moment the lid rose. Inside were 3 bodies carefully wrapped in thick layers of plastic. The bundles looked almost like oversized parcels, lined up side by side, but their shapes told a different story. The officers froze, the weight of the discovery sinking in slowly. The jogger, who had stayed nearby to see what would happen, never forgot the way the officers turned to each other in silence, their faces pale. The scene was too intentional to be a random act of violence. This wasn't someone panicking and dumping evidence. This was someone following a routine, someone who had done this before. Word spread quickly, as it always does in small towns. The black sedan became more than just an abandoned car. It became a crime scene that would pull apart every layer of the quiet community. People whispered about who could be behind it, wondering if the killer was a stranger passing through or someone they knew, someone who smiled at them in the grocery store. No one realized yet that the car itself, sitting silent under the bridge, held the first and most important clue. Whoever left it there believed they had time, but in reality, the moment those officers opened the trunk, the clock started ticking. The discovery of the car was shocking enough, but what came next showed just how careless the person behind it had been. Investigators carefully went through the vehicle, searching for even the smallest detail that could lead them closer to the truth. The bodies, wrapped so neatly, had suggested planning and precision. Yet the rest of the car told a different story. It was messy in a way that didn't match the cold organization of the trunk. Beneath the driver's seat, officers found a wallet half burned, as though someone had tried to destroy it but lost patience midway. Charred edges curled around the leather, but inside there were still fragments of IDs, names, and numbers that hadn't completely turned to ash. Whoever had driven the car had left behind breadcrumbs without realizing it. On the passenger seat, there was something even more disturbing, a torn notebook filled with rough sketches. The pages weren't just drawings, they looked like plans, diagrams of rooms, outlines of objects, unsettling scribbles with no explanations. They weren't dated, but some had markings that suggested a timeline, maybe even a sequence. Investigators flipped through page after page, their unease growing. This wasn't the work of someone who had acted in a burst of anger or impulse. This was someone who thought, prepared, and obsessed. The mud-covered license plates were the final piece. They'd been smeared in dirt, almost as though someone hoped they wouldn't be readable, but the numbers were still clear enough to match in the system. It didn't take long before the records pointed to a single name, Eric Dalton. Dalton was not a stranger in town. He was a mechanic known for his small garage tucked away near the industrial district. He had worked there for years, fixing cars, changing oil, replacing brakes. Customers described him as reliable, quiet, and always polite. Nothing about him seemed dangerous. He lived alone, drove modest vehicles, and didn't spend much time in public. But the closer investigators looked, the more his life seemed like a mask. His neighbors recalled how he sometimes disappeared without explanation, leaving his house dark for days. Some had even noticed him working late into the night, tools clanging long after the town had gone to sleep. What seemed like quirks of a solitary man now began to feel like signs of something much darker. When detectives dug deeper into his background, they were surprised by what they found, or rather, what they didn't find. He had no major criminal record, no history of violence, no trail of arrests that could have warned anyone. He blended in too well, hiding behind his trade and his quiet habits. The car full of bodies revealed a double life, one so carefully hidden that it had escaped notice for years. The notebook, the wallet, the plates, all of it painted a picture of someone who had been meticulous but made one fatal mistake. He left behind the very thing that connected everything back to him. The black sedan had not only carried the victims, it had carried his identity, and once that was uncovered, the chase began. When the police turned their attention to Dalton's garage, they expected to find an ordinary workplace filled with grease-stained overalls, half-repaired vehicles, and the usual smell of oil. From the outside, the building looked harmless enough, a plain structure with peeling paint and a weathered sign that swung slightly in the wind. But behind the closed doors was a world that revealed more about Dalton than anyone in town had ever suspected. The first room was what anyone would expect from a mechanic's shop: toolboxes stacked against the walls, rows of tires, and an old radio still tuned to a country station. Yet, as investigators pushed further in, the atmosphere shifted. The sounds of the outside world faded as they reached a section sealed off from view, a part of the garage that was never open to customers. At the back, hidden behind a steel door that had been carefully reinforced, they found the space that turned their suspicions into certainty. The walls were layered with soundproof material, thick padding that swallowed every echo. The floor carried stains that told their own story, patches where something had seeped deep into the concrete despite repeated attempts to scrub it away. The air was heavy with the faint odor of chemicals, bleach mixed with something far more unsettling. It was a room built not for fixing cars, but for something else entirely. On one table sat tools arranged with unsettling precision, not wrenches and sockets, but items that had been repurposed for control. Clamps, cords, and sharpened objects lay neatly aligned as though ready for use. The investigators cataloged every item, their unease growing as the picture became clearer. Dalton hadn't stumbled into violence, he had constructed a place for it. Against one wall stood a large cabinet, its drawers filled with objects that seemed ordinary until considered together: pieces of rope, old locks, rolls of plastic wrap. Tucked into another corner was a camera stand, the type used for recording, though the device itself was missing. It was as if the garage doubled as a workshop and a stage, one where Dalton had played out routines that no one outside those walls could have imagined. The most chilling discovery was the stack of boxes labeled with numbers. Inside were personal belongings, watches, earrings, wallets, and photographs. Each box contained pieces of different lives, small items that had once meant something to someone else. It was more than evidence, it was a collection, a catalog of his victims. The black sedan with its hidden cargo had hinted at a pattern, but this hidden room confirmed it. Dalton wasn't improvising, he was organized, methodical, and deliberate. What unsettled investigators most was how close it had all been to the community. Parents had brought their cars to him for tune-ups, co-workers had shared small talk while waiting for their vehicles, and neighbors had walked by countless times, never knowing what sat just a few feet away. The garage was not just a workplace, it was a fortress, a prison, and a graveyard of secrets. Each object told a story, and together they painted the portrait of a man who had managed to live in plain sight while building a world of horror just beyond a locked door. By the time investigators pieced together what had been happening inside Dalton's garage, he was already gone. He had vanished hours before the police arrived, leaving behind only the shell of his double life. While officers scoured through boxes and cataloged evidence, Dalton was sitting in a dimly lit motel room miles away, flipping through channels with a shaking hand. He wasn't running blindly, he was waiting, listening, trying to measure how much time he had left. The motel was the kind of place no one looked twice at. Cheap rooms with broken locks, stained curtains, and neon signs that flickered long into the night. From there, Dalton could blend in, just another traveler passing through. But what he couldn't control was the news that was spreading faster than he could move. The headline appeared sooner than he expected. Local stations led with it. Authorities had discovered multiple bodies in a car abandoned under a bridge. Dalton watched the footage in silence, the sound turned low, his eyes fixed on the screen. He saw images of police tape fluttering in the wind, officers leaning over the sedan, and reporters standing nearby with grave expressions. He knew exactly what was inside that trunk because he had placed it there himself. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. This wasn't a hidden room no one would enter, or a car parked carefully out of sight. This was national exposure. The trunk had been opened, and the mask he had built so carefully was slipping away. Witnesses later said they noticed Dalton pacing outside the motel late that night, smoking one cigarette after another, his face pale under the glow of the street light. He kept glancing at the lobby window where the television blared the story on repeat. Every detail that reporters revealed cut deeper into his calm. They weren't speaking in vague terms anymore. They had names, evidence, and a trail that pointed directly toward him. The license plates had been traced. His garage was under investigation. His life was no longer private. He wasn't a nameless shadow anymore, he was the man police were hunting. Dalton realized that the car had undone him in a way he hadn't anticipated. For years, he had managed to erase his traces, carefully hiding every part of his world, but the sedan was different. It was a vessel that carried not only his victims, but also the fragments of his life he had failed to burn away. The notebook with its sketches, the half-charred ideas, the careless smear of mud on the plates, it was all pointing directly to him. Each mistake built on the last until the image of Eric Dalton was now plastered across screens, whispered in diners, and pinned on police boards. He knew then that he couldn't keep running forever. The motel walls were closing in, the hum of traffic outside felt like a countdown, and every creak of the floorboards made him think the police had arrived. The realization was sharp and unavoidable. He wasn't just a suspect anymore. He was the hunted man in a story that had already broken wide open, and time was no longer on his side. What came next was not what anyone expected. Authorities believed Dalton would attempt to cross state lines, vanish into the sprawl of highways, or slip into one of the cities where no one knew his name. But instead of disappearing further, he circled back toward the place where it had all started. He drove through back roads under cover of darkness, headlights dimmed, carrying nothing but a small duffel bag and the weight of knowing the world was closing in on him. His destination was his own garage, the very place investigators had already torn apart in search of answers. It was almost as if he couldn't bear to leave it behind, as though the walls he had built and the secrets he had stored were more of a home to him than the life outside. Dalton arrived in the early hours of the morning, slipping quietly inside the building he had once used as a fortress. The police had cleared the space, but they couldn't take away the memories embedded in the walls. Everything smelled faintly of chemicals and char, and the silence was thick. For hours, he stayed there alone, moving from one corner to another like a man taking inventory of his past. The hidden room stood empty, its secrets stripped bare, yet Dalton treated it like a shrine. The cabinets were open, the boxes gone, but his eyes lingered on the stains in the floor, on the places where the padding had been peeled from the walls. He wasn't just seeing an empty space, he was replaying what it once held. When dawn began to break, Dalton made his decision. He doused the floor with accelerant, dragging lines of liquid across the garage until the fumes filled the air. He worked carefully, almost ritualistically, as though this final act needed to be done with the same precision he had used to build the room in the first place. He struck a match, and in seconds, flames crawled up the walls. The garage lit up like a beacon, fire tearing through wood, steel, and insulation. Neighbors woke to the sound of cracking beams and the glow that painted the sky orange. By the time firefighters arrived, the structure was fully consumed, a roaring blaze that sent smoke spiraling into the morning air. When the flames were finally brought under control, investigators combed through the wreckage. What they found was as puzzling as it was haunting. The garage was reduced to a skeleton of charred beams and twisted metal. The heat had been so intense that most of what remained was unrecognizable. And yet, no body was ever recovered. There were no bones, no ashes that could be tied definitively to Dalton. Some believed he had chosen to end his story in the fire, vanishing with the building he had once ruled. Others insisted he had staged it, using the blaze as a cover to slip away into another life, hidden once more in plain sight. The town was left with more questions than answers. The abandoned car under the bridge had exposed Dalton, but the fire had erased him just as quickly. His name lingered in headlines and whispered conversations, a reminder of how close darkness can live to ordinary life. For some, the story ended in that fire. For others, it was only the beginning of a mystery that may never truly be solved.